topic that I've got, occultural production and alienated agency. The main focus of this specific, obviously, occulture is my obsession, and this is what I talk about a lot. Don't worry, I won't be retreading over a lot of old ground. The specific focus today is this idea of alienated agency. And I want to talk about it with respect to the work that I do as an esoteric artist, as a practitioner scholar, and as a practicing magician. And those of you that know me know that I'm all of those things and openly all of those things. And that's a lot of why this conference is the way it is. But also for the record, just because I always say this, let's see. I'm also a skeptic, and I subscribe to multi-model agnosticism. Okay, so importantly, I do not, and I never have approached any esoteric practice, esoteric art, or broader interaction with occulture with credulity as a believer, okay, but rather as a experimentalist, experientialist, a phenomenologist. So I'm not a religionist, okay, and I think that's quite a crucial point that I'll probably come back to. Hang on. Now, I'm ostensibly finishing up my practice-based PhD on occulture and occultural production. I haven't been doing a great amount of my writing up period in the run-up to trans states. But that PhD sits in my home discipline of media communications and culture, which is an inherently interdisciplinary subject. So, in MCC, we employ a far wider range of practice-based and qualitative research methods, including, but not limited to, arts-based research methods, ethnography, autoethnography, action research, narrative research, and of course grounded theory as well. But there's a very broad range of research approaches that we take. And then within the arts, and my own arts, humanities, and social sciences bridging discipline of MCC, scholars, they examine, contextualize, and analyze the socio-cultural implications of various creative works as an act of post-mortem. That is something that we do. However, the approach is accompanied and complemented by practitioner scholars that push this examination into a more direct and intimate sphere, observing and analyzing themselves as they engage in the act of creation rather than relying solely on dissection of art after the fact. So my point here to raise is that in my particular field, we consider it absolutely essential to integrate and blend both theory and practice. That is to say, in my discipline, the practitioner scholar is the norm. Now, whether that be a practitioner scholar who understands themselves as an artist or practitioner in this arena has a double meaning, of course. For me, those things fold into each other a great deal, which of course is at the very heart of why trans states is the way it is. And you know, this is the pedagogical approach that I take with my students, because essentially, if we're trying to get them to understand about culture and cultural production, doing it from an objective, only kind of analyzing texts in this post-mortem sense, it will only give them kind of one piece of understanding of the whole body of knowledge, and the other piece can only come with actually engaging in cultural production and engaging in cultural discourse. So, artists, what I want to talk about, and what I'm talking about here is basically I'm trying to frame my understanding of my research from this subjective position of being a practitioner and someone who over the last 6 years has been trying to understand what occulture is and what occultural production is through being it and making it, if that makes sense, including where we are right now. And I consider trans states itself part of my research and a piece of occultural production. So this raises then, for me, one of the reasons that I consider alienated agency as being like a characteristic part of occulture is this kind of sense in which artists don't just employ media, but are often themselves media, okay? So certainly the esoteric artist as medium is like a well-understood phenomenon. Jung has famously spoken at some length about the creative process itself being autonomous, but I've just thrown up a couple of examples. Here we have: the creative urge lives and grows in the artist like a tree in the earth, from which it draws its nourishment. We would do well, therefore, to think of the creative process as a living thing implanted in the human psyche. In the language of analytical psychology, this living thing is an autonomous complex. It is a split-off portion of the psyche which leads a life of its own outside the hierarchy of consciousness. Depending on its energy charge, it may appear either as a mere disturbance of conscious activities or as a supraordinate authority which can harness the ego to its purpose. And like a couple of key words in there, of course, are hierarchy and authority, which I will probably come back to. And then I've got a secondary quote there. Every creative person is a duality or a synthesis of contradictory qualities. Thinking about Eric's talk this morning. On the one side, it was a long time ago, he is a human being with a personal life, while on the other side, he is an impersonal creative process. I'm thinking about becoming one of those people that starts putting sick beside he, because it does really irritate me. I'm going to start doing that. I'm making my promise now. Okay, so this is something that I always talk to my students about when I have classes about, we sit down and we just have a chat about what is creativity and what is the creative process. And when I ask them if they've ever had an experience of creation where it's felt like they've had to get out of the way and something has come through them, to date, I've never had anyone who hasn't at some point in their life had this experience of a sense of whatever way you want to frame it, you know, whether it's your idea of inspiration or whether it's, you know, some sort of channeling or download. But there's this, in fact, this is something that when Eric and I were chatting last night about the ontological validity of DMTLs, we did actually also segue onto chatting about this very experience of feeling like a work comes through you, and that how somehow it has its own agency, and that you don't have ownership of it or authorship of it in some sense. And this is a very, very, very common experience, and it's something that is, I think, as I say, essential in defining what ends up having something being understood as occultural. And it's this aspect of the alienated agency. So, Marco Pazzi, this phrase, by the way, I'm borrowing from Marco Pazzi. Here's my alienated agency slide. Marco's written about this phenomenon with respect to esoteric art. Where I'm going to say he coined the phrase where I've read it. Alienated agency is used in other different disciplines as well. So whether alienated agency is derived from discrete entities with ontological validity, or whether they are whether this is some kind of function of our consciousness, some kind of dissociated psyche which creates the kind of experience of it being in some way other. Again, as discussing with Eric last night, I find that really uninteresting because it's a completely unanswerable question. And also, it possibly being a both and thing or having the status of either or it seems to be an essential kind of part of its function as well. Again, as Eric, you were talking about, it's more about the relationality between you and the sense of the other, rather than whether the other has any discrete, I'm not sure I have any discrete ontological validity, so I'm not sure I should be making judgments about the entities that I've encountered. So And as I've already said, I'm not a religionist, I'm not a believer. And as I've talked about my research methods, I'm much more interested in looking at processes, and I'm less interested in concerning myself with like arguments about ontology, but with application and pragmatics, okay? So these arguments as to status of real or imagined are futile, but not the study of their effects and implications. And what's important about these experiences we have with alienated agents and entities of all kind is it doesn't really matter what their ontological status is. In the interrelation with them, they function as though they are other, and there are consequences and effects because of that. So just to define alienated agency in terms of how Marco Pazzi put forward, by alienated agency, I mean that the ultimate authorship of a strongly innovative or radical artistic discourse is attributed to entities subjectively independent from the author's self. Because of this perceived independence, so Marco's taken a position there, because of this perceived independence, alienated agency allows the artist to develop a certain freedom of expression from predominant conventions and norms. It's not just the fact that the artistic creation is attributed to some external spiritual source, but also the fact that this is part of some cosmic plan. And for me, importantly, which gives the artist even more confidence in transgressing cultural or aesthetic boundaries. And I've just got a secondary citation regarding this kind of concept of what is being referred to as alienated production this time. So the main draw of mediumistic works, such as Manveld's, and indeed their key feature was their alienated production. They were discussed, reproduced, exhibited, and collected because they functioned as evidence of the possibility of occult communication and are more or less documentary in character. The innovative character of mediumistic art lies occasionally in their formal or aesthetic aspects, but predominantly in their claims to authorless creation or authorial displacement. Okay. Where am I going next? So here's just how I see myself. Because for a long time, actually, similarly to how with my students, we're looking at cultural production, and therefore we're taking this theory practice blended look at the subject. So this is how I view myself in my work, and my engagement as both an artist and practitioner scholar in occultural production, and that what I'm dealing with is occultural studies. And I'm going to expand a little bit more about how later, very briefly, about how occultural studies can be understood as, obviously it's a subsection of cultural studies, but how it's slightly different. I'm going to skip that. I just wanted to touch on occulture. I won't say a great deal because I've spoken about it at length in other talks, and it's not the main focus of what I wanted to say. But I just wanted to really quickly pull up this definition, because, again, we're often looking at occulture and how it's defined in terms of, what particularly Partridge has written extensively about it, being as he introduced the term into the scholarly community. But I want to go back to in Carl Abrahamsson's book Occulture. He's got this amazing quote from Jen, which I wanted to refer back to, who they had clearly, I felt that this had come when they were writing up for Carl's book, and I felt that it was a beautiful kind of poetic re-explanation that I can't be sure about this because I hadn't had the opportunity, but I felt like Jen had some understanding of how the term had been taken on, and then came back with this like beautiful kind of re-understanding of it, which referred, I think, to both kind of the scholarly work and some of the more popularist uses of the term. So occulture is a word that was inevitable. At any given moment, our sensory environment is whispering to us, telling us hidden stories, revealing subliminal connections. This concealed dialogue between every level of popular cultural forms and magical conclusions is what we named occulture. And so for me, this is really beautiful, because this is precisely what I mean about alienated agency, and this understanding of what occulture is really about is about forms of communication with all of the possible agents in one's environment, whatever they might be. Okay, so, and then so all of the different things that we end up engaging with in esotericism, whether that be demons or god forms, or, you know, all of these various different forms of entity encounter, or right down to just divination itself, or some kind of sense of animism. It's about this relational aspect with alienated agents within one's world who have some kind of sense of autonomy, right? Whether that's real or imagined, whether it's constructed or not. This communication, which, you know, is of course, well, who have we got here? What this conference is about, right? This is the God that we're invoking with the magician card. So, in my previous work, I've talked about this, and I've talked about how occulture has a close relationship with radical alterity and ineffable otherness. And I don't want to unpack that a great deal now. There's some pretty obvious reasons for why, for me, it's about the kind of ineffable aspects, and that's because, for me, when we're looking at culture and we're looking at the cultural field, it's a language field. It's a field of language, and that's everything in that is dialogic. But when we're talking about, for example, experiences of direct revelation and gnosis, this is not something, right? By definition, it's something that can't be communicated, and that's because it exists outside of the field of culture. It's a direct experience. Okay, it's got this relationship with non-dualism, which is always really tricky to talk about for obvious reasons, right? Because language is dialogic, it's binary, and so every attempt to kind of talk about aspects of non-dualism, we come into difficulty. But so occulture is about the dissemination and mediation of a particular set of ideas, practices, beliefs, and symbols through the actors, networks, and fora of the cultural field. So it's inherently about communication and mediation, as I've said. And so within culture, occulture is produced, it's read, it's interpreted, it's politically negotiated in all of the same ways that culture more broadly is. But all culture is always signposting, and it's always pointing back to something mysterious and alienated, to some non-linguistic source, which may be the Lacanian real or some other. There are different, again, I'm not here to choose a model, but there are different things that can be mapped onto this. And the extent to which something is occultural, therefore, can be evaluated by the extent to which it mediates unlanguageable and incommunicable experiences through networks, processes, and actors within the field of culture. So, for example, one example is, of course, an experience of gnosis, which is incommunicable. But, you know, I haven't got the slide here. We'll come to it later. Something being incommunicable doesn't prevent people from talking about it, but quite the opposite. As has been commented on many people, not least of all by Walter Hanegraaff and Kreipel, the opposite is true, that these experiences of the ineffable cause people to talk endlessly about said experiences, even though, and I made this point when I spoke at Breaking Convention, because this can be mapped onto people that have ineffable psychedelic experiences, right? That just will not stop talking about them endlessly, no matter how much you ask them politely not to. So, It's true. So occulture is always either directly or indirectly about communication with others, and indeed otherness, and the sourcing of noetic material beyond the boundaries of language. And so whether, as I say, it is directly experienced through gnosis, or it's through one of these encounters with some form of alien agent or entity, they are different in type, but it is experiences of this nature which are at the root of what then gets mapped out through the various cultural processes and networks and for it to be understood as occulture at large. I'm just going to skip a few.
I think we're also starting to head toward final remarks if you want to chat.
Yeah, okay. Well, let's see where I want to round it up. All right, so I guess what I'm going to end up talking about tomorrow when I have our panel discussion is this idea of the value, the pragmatic value in understanding things to have a life of their own. And actually, you know, the process of entification, I mean, I don't have time to kind of like go into it in too much detail, but anyone that, again, has read Latour will probably see where some of this connects through, right, into actor network theory. But the agency of a given thing doesn't require it to have intentionality in any sense or ontological validity. Something can be made an agent and it can be given agency. And we do this all the time, right? We all understand this. This is what corporations are, right? Legal persons. And we can entify anything simply by naming it and giving it an identity, which is precisely what I've done with trans states. And whether or not it actually has a life of its own, it has functioned as though it has. I've had experiences of material relating to it, coming to me, through me, as we've discussed before. And you know, there's been a sense of some kind of guiding hand. And I'm really fascinated by this as a skeptic, okay? Because you can take a kind of believer type reading of this, that there's, you know, some kind of legitimately magical process and that things do have their own kind of life or whatever, but it's not necessary. The point that fascinates me is that we have the capacity to create a situation where things will function as though they do and reap the rewards of that. So it may be true, it may not. I will remain on the fence for now and forever. But there are other values in the concept of alienated agency. It frees up the possibility for escaping the bounds of the authority, of hegemony, of the existing norms and programs, because it's a methodology for creating an outside. Again, whether that's real or imagined, that becomes a process for breaking out of the confines of the systems and the programs that we're confined within our kind of existing kind of cultural moment, which is another essential part of what all culture is. It's anti-authoritarian, it's subversive, it's culturally engineering, and it's transformational. And this kind of concept of the alienated agency plugs directly into all of those really valuable things that all culture can and does do. And I'll leave it there.